Should I join you? We'll all clear our throat together. I had a funny thought on the way here. I thought, well, what do you speak to a Buddhist group about on Easter? It sounds like the beginning of some sort of joke, I suppose, but I didn't really think of it as a joke, but it is kind of funny. I've always thought of meditation, like we were just doing, as a sort of a way of entering into death, actually. It's the real gift of meditation, is entering into a conscious, willing consent to entering into the domain of death. Not the idea of death, because the idea of death has little or nothing to do with death, but the actual domain of it. Because the domain of death is a very... Once we get beyond our ideas of it, of just funerals and people dying and all that kind of stuff, which is significant, of course. But even in that kind of death, even in a physical sense, because meditation is sort of a metaphysical or psychological death. It's a consent to entering into that space. To let go is another way of saying to die. And I'm sure some of you know, if you let go enough when you meditate, it has a lot of the hallmarks of death. You lose the sense of your body in a deep samadhi. You might even lose the sense of whether you're breathing or not. It looks a lot like death. You're quiet. That looks a lot like death. If you're get in a very deep state, of course, you're not thinking anymore. That's a lot like death. You're not worrying about the future. That's a lot like death. You are stuck in the eternal now, which is exactly like death. No past, no future, not even a present, because it takes a kind of self-reflecting quality to think, well, I'm in the present moment now. Right? The present moment is just as much of a construct as the past moment is. Right? So when all those kind of cease, which is ideally what we consent to when we meditate. We can't make it happen, but we can consent to the possibility of it happening. We just let it all go. This kind of death. And you can't drag your life into death with you. So you can't drag your ideas. You can't drag your opinions in there with you. You can't drag your sort of self-referencing consciousness that's wanting to know, so how am I doing? Am I getting this? Am I good at this? How long have we been doing this? This is the longest 20 minutes of my life, or the fastest. And having recently, in the last month, been lucky enough to be present during my father's passing away, one of the things that was most striking about the actual moment of passing away was, any of you who've been with somebody when they pass away, if you're really paying attention, you can very obviously feel the exact instant when something, whatever you want to call it, leaves the body. It doesn't take someone of much awareness at all to actually notice it. It's pretty obvious. And yet at that moment, when I was with him during that moment, I was immediately reminded of when I was in the delivery room with my younger sister. And this is going back 20 years ago when she had her first child. And I was struck by how much his death felt like being in the delivery room when I was with my sister having her first child. And those of you who may have been around when someone actually dies, it is this strange coming together of a paradox of that there's a feeling, a deep and profound feeling of birth with death, that they actually have a very same feeling. There's a certain newness about it and a certain kind of vitality that's part of the presence of both of those kinds of experiences. And it occurred to me also that even before the physical death, I watched my father go through a type of death also, over the 5 years before that, with a heart attack and then a stroke and then finally cancer. And those slowly eroded, what would you say? They were slowly eroded his suffering. Which is strange to say, because most people would think, oh, an awful heart attack, and then to have that followed up by the stroke, and then to cap it all off, you get killed by cancer. Like that's like a prescription for suffering, or for sorrow, or why did life take this out on me, kind of thing. But it was actually the absolute opposite experience. That as each of these illnesses occurred for him, he got exponentially more open, more free, more loving, more caring, more appreciative, more of almost all the good stuff in life, really. Right up to the point of before he passed, and we were up at the house in Oregon during Christmas, and we didn't even know he had cancer at that time, but he had been physically sort of degrading, and everyone thought it was the stroke sort of symptoms getting worse, and he could really hardly stand up, and so he went back into a little rehab clinic where he lived there for 2 or 3 weeks, and they rehabbed him every day in the hope to get him a little stronger, and so he would be able to stay at the house for a longer period of time. And so he was in this rehab clinic. He went back from being at home into this rehab clinic just before I had gone up there, me and my wife Mukti, to be with my parents for Christmas. So you would think that this would be a prescription for a very sort of depressing sort of moment for him, to have to leave home right before Christmas, go into a rehab, have all the family come up to see everybody, and yet he's in a rehab clinic, and we're driving to the rehab clinic every day to come see him. And it's, you're walking in this place. It was nice, but it was also kind of dreary walking down the hallways. It was really felt much more like a hospice than a rehab clinic. Most people were very, very old, and I remember we would visit him every day. He got to come home on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day for 4 hours. He called it his furlough. They let him out for 4 hours on those 2 days, and about halfway through the visit, I said to him, so Dad, how do you feel about being in this, in this rehab center and the whole thing? And at any other point in his life, he would have, I'm sure, gone into a long complaint list of how, terribly depressing it would be to be away from your family and in a rehab center and this whole thing at this time of year. And he simply said, I was getting a little bored around the house. I was getting a little bored around the house, so the change of view I actually kind of like. And what is it that gets somebody to make this immense leap? Which is it's an immense leap. For most people would not be happy in that situation, nor would have he been happy some years ago. This is a huge transformation, just that. For someone to say that and really mean it. Really mean it. I was getting a little bored at looking the same walls, and so checking into this rehab center isn't so bad. And it occurred to me that it was a kind of death. It was a kind of death before he physically passed away, which was allowing a kind of life. It was the same thing that I noticed right at the end of his life, at this strange coming together, this paradox of death, the feeling, the experience of death, and the experience of birth, of some sort of new vitality coming into that moment, were strangely converging at the moment of his actual passing. And when I look back, I could see that these two elements had been converging certainly over the last 2 or 3 years. That as he was losing certain physical capacities, even some cognitive capacity got slowed down by the stroke, although he was still he still retained a real brightness of mind. But the death of certain parts of the body not working, and the death of a whole way of compartmentalizing life, the way human beings do, and all of that really falling away. And so his illnesses were actually taking away. It wasn't just taking away his physical strength, it actually took away much more psychological suffering than it was taking away physical capacity. It doesn't always work this way, but it's awful nice when it does, And as I saw this happening for him over the last few years, I kind of thought of him as he kind of turned into the love guy. That you couldn't talk to him for more than a minute without him telling you how much he loved you. You couldn't do the slightest, most menial thing for him without saying how much he appreciated you doing it. It was really quite a amazing thing to see somebody that I think in the conventional way of thinking about things had almost every reason to complain. His body's falling apart, and everything's sort of sliding downhill, and yet something else is coming forth, something of great vitality, some way of appreciating life, some way of the heart really, really, really opening, which is directly tied into something passing away, something deeply being let go of at some very sort of subterranean level. And as I said, to me, something like meditation ideally is a way of consenting to that kind of letting go. I think we often think we hear these terms, letting go, non-attachment, desire, and, we hear lots of teachings about them. And, it can be so easy to assume that we know what those words mean, because we hear them so often. That in Buddhist circles there's so much talk about non-attachment and all that kind of stuff. And yet, why is it that so many of us human beings have such a hard time really letting go? When letting go is what makes us happy. Just imagine if you could, just even imagine. Don't even try, because trying is a way of not letting go. So don't even try, but just imagine that for some reason you could not psychologically resist anything right now. Nothing in your past, nothing about yesterday, nothing about 5 minutes ago. You couldn't resist anything about your meditation. Even this moment, you couldn't resist anything. Even if you didn't even like my talk, you thought, this guy's rather boring. But even that, you couldn't resist. You know the resistance. It's a psychological, it's a emotive kind of energy. It's something inside that's sort of putting the brakes on. Just imagine that you, for 5 minutes, completely lost the capacity to resist. To say internally, to say no to what is, was, or may be. Now, if you just imagine that you had no resistance, now just try to imagine, now how are you going to suffer? How are you going to pull it off? You get the feel? How would you do it without going into resistance? You could say, well, I could go into desire. Yes, but if you didn't resist not getting the object of your desire, then your desire wouldn't even cause you problems. You just desire something. but you wouldn't have any resistance to not getting what you desire. So if you imagine it, you'd actually literally have to go back into some form of resistance in order to start to struggle. I would also add, since I was talking about sort of an open-heartedness with what my father came into, you would also have to resist to get your heart to close down. You couldn't actually pull it off without something in you saying no. You know? And so since really if we only did this one thing, if we only just stopped resisting, we would be so much more happy. Don't get me wrong, to let go of resistance doesn't mean you'd get rid of your discrimination. It doesn't mean you'd agree with everything or like everything or consent to everything. It just means you wouldn't push against it. You kind of get the feeling, I think. To let go of resistance is a kind of death. Because if you look at why don't I let go of my resistance? Not only the really obvious stuff, but even the really subtle stuff. Why is it that I don't let go of my resistance? Is it if it causes me so much sorrow, why is it that I don't let it go? Well, because it's a death, isn't it? It's not just letting go of resistance. When you let go of resistance, you're letting go of something very, very big. There's a whole way of being oriented in life. There's a whole way of being oriented towards yourself. Way that we define ourselves through what we resist and what we crave. But often our resistance is so tied into who we unconsciously, not even consciously, feel and think and experience that we are. That to let go of all that is a death. And in a certain sense, meditation, like we were just doing, is a way of finding within yourself a space of being where this has actually already occurred. A space of being where this is actually where it is already the case. Where it's already the case that there is a dimension of your existence where you're not resisting. It's already there. Meditation might help you come into contact with it. But if you're not careful, meditation can take you farther away from it. Because your meditation can become a sort of avenue of sort of institutionalized struggle. Have you ever felt that way when you meditate? I don't think there's anybody in this room that hasn't. You know, if you're not careful, your meditation can be the place where your unsatisfactoriness, your unhappiness plays itself out, you know? Where you're resisting while you're meditating, but you're actually resisting. You know, your mind's too busy. You're thinking about something you don't want to think about. You're feeling something you don't want to feel. And so you resist that. And you go, I'm not supposed to do that. So you try to let go of your resistance, but you really can't let go of resistance. So now you're resisting having resistance. You know? And in the rest of your life, you could just change the channel. You know, just go do something, turn on the TV, go for a walk, call up a friend, do anything so you didn't have to sit there in the middle of it. But when you're meditating, you know, the thing about it is you're stuck with yourself. Right? That's the beauty and the horror of meditation, is you're stuck with yourself. And you get to see yourself. You get to see your patterns. You get to see the beauty and the difficulty, the holding, everything. All of it. That's the beauty of it. And any kind of form of meditation is some way or another of becoming familiarized with our own inner landscape.